Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we really did not recess. So if our witnesses would now take their assigned seats, I suspect the second panel will take a very long time but be equally interesting. And I do want to thank all of you for your patience. This is a very long time for many of you to sit here. We now recognize our second panel, starting with Mr. Bob Wright, who is the co-founder of Autism Speaks. Mr. Scott Badish is the president of the Autism Society of Directors of Safe Minds. And I would ask that Mr. Kelly introduce and make a short statement about the witness he helped bring here.
I thank the Chairman. One of the great honors I have is representing Northwest Pennsylvania and Mercyhurst College. Mr. McGarry, Bradley McGarry, is with us today. Mercyhurst is one of the leaders, if you didn't know this, around the country, starting in 1986. Addressing these types of problems, and they have initiatives that can be taken, and the ability to help those with lesser degrees of autism to integrate into society and make great contributions. So, Mr. McGarry, it's so nice to have you here and representing Mercyhurst. You do great things. And in 2008, your program, the Asperger Initiative at Mercyhurst, is one that's being looked at all over the country and is a perfect model that lets us to go forward and address some of these issues. So, Mr. McGarry, thanks so much for being here.
I thank you both.
I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. And we now recognize Mr. Michael John Carley. He's the Executive Director of the Global and Regional Asperger Syndrome Partnership. And least, we recognize Mr. Ari Naiman. He is the President of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Again, as you saw in the first panel, pursuant to the rules of this committee, I'd ask you all rise now to take your oath and raise your right hands. Do you all solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I have carefully viewed and all answered in the affirmative. Please take your seats. You are a large panel, and you have a lot to say. I would only mention that there are 20 groups behind you who were not fortunate enough to be seated with you. So please, to the greatest extent possible, make sure you finish right at 5 minutes so that we can get to Q&A, much of which will help with issues that may be beyond your opening statements. With that, we recognize Mr. Wright. I'm afraid your microphone is not quite on or close enough. Could you also pull it a little closer?
Okay.
There's a sort of a skill we gain here of getting to the mic and really getting to it. It goes with being a congressman, I'm afraid.
Well, let's see how we do here.
You have what it takes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chairman Issa, very much for having us. And Ranking Member Cummings, thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank Dan Burton for all the work that he's done over many years to bring awareness and attention to and discussion of and action on autism. Very, very important. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Smith, who has done an extraordinary job as well all over the country and with the coalition and many others, and I'm personally involved with him in many, so thank you for everything you have done for all of us. I want to say I'm here because of my grandson, Christian, who's now 11 years old, and my daughter, Katie, is sitting back here, and my wife, Suzanne. And he was a boy that was 2 years old, and we thought he was very precocious. He seemed to be brighter than average. He walked early. He had enormous vocabulary, and then he lost everything. And I'll tell you, without any secret, that my daughter, firmly believes that vaccines were the relationship that triggered him into this pit. So we lost a little boy that we knew. It wasn't like He was a disabled person who got more disabled. He was a boy, and we lost him. And that's what led us to found Autism Speaks. We could take care of Christian, but we saw so many others out there, and I traveled around the country. And I sat at meetings similar to the meeting you're having here, where I would ask questions about autism. I went to universities, I went to medical schools, and I got the worst answers imaginable. Actually, I heard some of the same answers here just a few minutes ago in the panel. They must be, they're on a Twitter thing or something. It was, we don't know, but we're sure. Or it's, we're sure, but we don't know. But we really don't know, but we're sure. And that was a lot of the issues. Why are the numbers so high and so forth? So we got into this and said, we called around to find like-minded people, and that's how Autism Speaks got founded. And we've been fortunate. We've raised a considerable amount of money. We have 250 full-time employees around the country. We have 90 walks. We have 400 and some odd thousand will walk for us here. We have activities outside the United States. But all of that's based on that little boy. And the fact that in all my business career, I was shocked that I was so ignorant of all the situation. And then when I got into it and tried to learn, I was even more shocked that nobody was helpful and that we were just trapped in a maze here of obviously escalating issues, all kinds of things. So I'm going to try to answer a couple of things, or at least bring some help here. We talked about the 1 in 88, which is exactly the, that is the U.S. number. Now, the CDC's is what they call a passive, it's a passive resource. They go around and they look at medical records that are existing. That's a variable. And they also look at school records. That's a variable. They do not talk to children. There's no clinical evaluation. They don't talk to parents or anything. And that partly accounts for some of the differences when you go around the country. Some schools have better records, some schools don't, some so whatever. And that's what they do. The Korean study that we financed, which is the most, it's the gold-plated model on how to do this. We went through the same process in Korea with Koreans, with Japanese, with Americans, and we ended up finding out that there was about 1% of the population, which is just what we had here. But then a second thing happened. Parents wanted to offer comments about what we were doing, because we were only doing the school records and all that sort of thing. And the school district said, fine, it's a 100,000 population area in Seoul. And the school, we asked parents that wanted to come in that they could come in and offer comments and so forth. Well, they came in and had all kinds of issues, and we separated them out. It took 2 years. And out of that, we actually had 1% more of the entire community, of that same community, diagnosed with autism. Well, we brought people in. And so the number is 2.657%. I have no reason to believe that that number won't be duplicated in the United States with that methodology. That's why we're financing this effort to convince the CDC that they don't actually have a disagreement with the number. Their position was, we don't have any money. We can't afford that. That costs more money. We only do this. And that sort of speaks for itself. But I'll also tell you that—
If you could do that in summation, please.
Yeah. I'll also tell you that we have, they spend almost no money on autism, $20 million, $30 million, including all of the safety issues. We could fix that in an hour for about $35 million a year on top of what they do. So the name of this committee, the oversight, government reform, there's a real issue there. I wish they weren't even involved with us, but they're the only ones that did prevalence. We are on page 7 of their two-page top priority list, and autism is right at the bottom of it. And I don't know why Dr. Boyle, but the nature of, I guess, being in a larger thing, they won't want to say, we have no money, we don't have any priority, I can't get anybody to hear, and I don't complain enough. So this is about speaking up.
Thank you very much. And we now go to Mr. Badish. With the same microphone problem you will all have. It's an acquired skill, and I appreciate you all for learning it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and the other members of the committees. My wife and I are the very proud father of Evan Badish, who's a 25-year-old son with autism who attends Marshall University, which, like the other school represented on this panel, is thriving and helping so many with autism. But he is one of the more fortunate with autism. The Autism Society of America is the nation's largest and oldest grassroots organization dedicated to the autism spectrum. As has been discussed today, the incidence of autism has shown marked increases in CDC surveillance rates, currently at 1 out of 88 births. Many children and adults may not be properly diagnosed, and this number may actually be higher than the actual incidence. We applaud the work of the CDC and appreciate the partnership we have with the CDC, and particularly efforts we are working with the CDC on addressing better some of the questions asked earlier about how we can increase the growing disparity of the autism diagnosis rates among people of color and other ethnicities and geographic location. We would suggest that currently the services for autism are difficult at best to navigate, and often when services are provided, they may not be individualized or be the best approach for the needs of the individual. The Autism Society is about helping people today and preparing them for tomorrow, and we believe that government services, if funded by government dollars, should have focus on advancing an individual's quality of life in measurable and meaningful ways. We need to reexamine how government services can be provided, not on a limited definition of services, but rather based on an individual's needs. As I noted today, there is a significant disparity in the need for available funds for both long-term and to support people with disabilities. This disparity has resulted in very long waiting lists for services throughout our country, and estimates have that waiting list being anywhere from 80,000 individuals nationally to as many as 200,000 people who go without services each day. Meeting this significant need will not only require expansion of services, but we believe it requires us as a society and government to think differently about the way services are delivered. An individual today who is diagnosed and eligible for services and then put on a waiting list is denied the critical services that we all know could help him or her move forward in addressing quality of life needs. We recognize that funds are limited, and we would encourage the committee to examine ways that if funds have to be cut, that they not be cut at the expense of individuals, but at the expense of unnecessarily duplication and administrative services. We also would encourage this committee in its role to look at the public schools. Public schools are required by law to provide every child with an appropriate education, and unfortunately 50% of students with disabilities are either dropping out or not graduating or not receiving appropriate degrees. This is very difficult when we look at how to help those children in adult life. We also believe that government services must be outcome-based, and we must encourage that those services aim to help a person maximize his or her independence and self-sufficiency. And we also have to take a recognition that as a nation, while we are very concerned about an unemployment rate when it goes above 5 or 6%, the reality is that for the individuals with people with disabilities, that rate is as high as 78.5%. Government's response are most effective also when resources are available under one umbrella, and any parent or any individual who has had to navigate the system will say it's impossible to navigate. The committee needs to also look at how we can more effectively, and we would argue at a much lower cost, coordinate the government's response through a one-stop model or a centralization of information. We also would encourage this committee to look at the issue of Medicaid portability. When a person moves from one State to another, he or she loses their Medicaid community support services and has to start over again. This is particularly of concern to military families when they get relocated from one base to another. Finally, I want to mention about the Combating Autism Act and the Interagency Coordinating Council. With all respect to our prior speaker, we would disagree with a lot of what he said. This is a group that in concept could do a great job of coordination, but in reality it's not. If a body is going to be in fact a coordinating body, it has to include private and not-for-profit sectors, and we have to be an equal partner at the table. It also has to include government representatives from the Department of Labor, Justice, Housing, and Defense. And it also has to meet. We also support very strongly and encourage the continued funding of training components of the Combating Autism Act. Finally, I would just like to encourage that, as said prior to all this, the need for adult services is extensive. When you talk about a fiscal cliff, the greatest cliff that occurs in our community is that when a person turns 21 and absolutely no services are available for that person when they need. And again, we thank the committee, and I'll be happy to answer any questions when all the other speakers are over.
Thank you, Mr. Badish. Mr. Wright, did you just have one quick point?
A piece of information just came to my attention. The Senate just passed the TRICARE Amendment, restoring all military personnel ABA therapy, whether retired or in service. It's taken 5 years to do that. 5 years.
Mr. Blaxall, you are now recognized for your testimony. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here to represent Safe Minds, grateful to the Chairman and to Congressman Burton for his terrific work, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to represent the community of autism families. I would like to enter into the record, we've collected testimonials in the last couple of days from over 300 autism families who wanted to attend the hearing but could not. And you can read their statements here.
Without objection, so ordered. We will include that in the record.
I wrote a book on autism. It argues that autism is a new condition. In 1935, Leo Kanner wrote this book. It's 537 pages long, not a whisper of autism in any of it. 3 years later, he saw the first child with autism, a family from Mississippi that came all the way up to visit him, and he'd never seen a child like Donald Triplett before. In 1943, he wrote his famous paper in which he argued, since 1938, there have come to our attention a number of children whose condition differs so markedly and uniquely from anything reported so far that each case merits a detailed consideration of its fascinating peculiarities. Before 1930, the rate of autism in the world and in America was effectively zero. Today, nearly 70 years after Kanner's paper, reported autism rates are 1 in 88. In New Jersey, 1 in 29 boys born in 2000 were diagnosed as autistic. What's going on? Why are so many American children sick? I think we have to face reality. We need to be clear. Autism is a public health crisis of historic proportions, worse than poliomyelitis. It's devastating a generation of children and their families. We need to face that reality. Autism is a national emergency. Can we skip to slide 5? There's a summary here of historical autism surveys in America. For a long time, we had low rates in America, about 1 in 10,000. Keep flipping. There we go. Then around 1990, something new and terrible happened to a generation of children. Autism rates didn't just rise, they multiplied. This escalation covered both full syndrome autism and the broader autism spectrum, including Asperger's. Some people claim this isn't real, that we're just doing better diagnosing. That's just wrong. If you read the old literature, the old surveys, they looked for everybody, and they couldn't find people. They didn't miss 99% of the children with autism. It's not hard to find a child with autism. It's obvious when they're autistic. The notion that we're just doing better diagnosing, even in the CDC studies, they're using the same methodology. So when you see those numbers rising, that's not because the methods are changing, it's because there are more cases. In the midst of this crisis, the Federal agencies responsible for the health of our children have failed in their duty. CDC's negligence has led the way. Many of us believe CDC has actively covered up evidence surrounding autism's environmental causes. NIH, meanwhile, has received the lion's share of funding, money they've wasted on status quo research and gene studies. It's absurd to focus on genetic research in this crisis. There's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. I'll skip past a couple of examples of malfeasance. I'll just say that in the financial world, the result of pressure to manipulate numbers to provide the answers that bosses want has a name. It's called securities fraud. In medicine, there are similar pressures. They're called special interest politics and even peer review. And what CDC has given us is the medical equivalent of securities fraud, all to avoid the inconvenient reality of the autism epidemic. In the face of a national emergency, government agencies, especially CDC and NIH, have performed poorly and behaved badly. We need accountable new leadership on autism at NIH and CDC. We need an advisory committee that believes in combating autism, not newly stocked with appointees who actually oppose that mission. We need a Combating Autism Act that truly combats autism. We need to stop investing in the autism gene hunt and identify what has changed in the environment that it could possibly have injured so many children. The scope and the magnitude of these changes, it's complicated, yes, but it can't be that complicated. There have to be a very small list of things that could have changed. Ultimately, we need to face and answer the question, why are so many children sick? We'll only do that hard work if agency leaders are held accountable to the American people, not powerful interests in the medical industry. So we're asking you, the members of the committee, for your help. Please, let's not make this hearing a one-time episode. Please stay on the job in the next Congress. Root out the failures, the waste, the fraud, the negligence, and the abuse in these agencies that aren't doing their job. We need CDC and NIH to do their jobs, and they're not. There's a crisis. We need your help. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blaxall. Mr. McGarry, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to address this committee and to discuss the rise in autism spectrum disorders, its impact on post-secondary education, and the allocation of government resources for ASD. As we've discussed, the CDC now indicates that 1 of every 88 births in America results in a child diagnosed and living with autism spectrum disorders. As these numbers are staggering, students diagnosed with ASD are now of age where they are applying to higher education institutions across the United States in the same record numbers. It is estimated that within the next 2 years, 1 of every 100 college applicants will have an ASD diagnosis, and this is just the beginning of the wave that has been characterized as epidemic. In 1984, the Learning Differences program at Mercyhurst University has educated and assisted nearly 1,000 students with disabilities to succeed in college, earn a degree, and go on to make a difference in the world. In 2008, Mercyhurst introduced the Asperger Initiative at Mercyhurst to meet the unique needs of the growing population of college students diagnosed with Asperger syndrome and ASD. The AIM program focuses on building a foundation of self-advocacy, social skills, and sound academic progress. Thanks to an appropriations grant in 2009, we did receive $100,000 from the U.S. Department of Education, and we were able to launch the AIM program. 2 short years later, in 2011, Best Colleges Online ranked our Asperger Initiative at Mercyhurst number 3 in the nation on their list of impressive special college programs for students with autism. Mercyhurst President Tom Gamble emphasized that Mercyhurst believes that capable students, if given the environment and opportunity to succeed, will do just that. Dr. Gamble has committed Mercyhurst to continuing the development of the Asperger program. Very few colleges and universities across the United States offer a program of collegiate support like AIM for this cohort of students. Too few are equipped to educate college and post-secondary students diagnosed with ASD. We have found that AIM students are able to excel academically, but most have a great need for internships and job coaching. Few have ever held a part-time job or understand the nuances of the workplace. The Department of Labor and Industries Office of Vocational Rehabilitation has been helpful in providing support for our AIM students, but is limited to only supporting students or employees, and neither internships nor job coaching are covered under current OVR restrictions. Jane Tearfield Brown cautions in her book, Students with Asperger's Syndrome, A Guide for College Personnel. The 1 in 88 number of incidents cited by the CDC will begin to be realized when overeducated and under or unemployed adults with AS are brought into the welfare and social services systems. Individuals without jobs will pose a burden on their families, on insurance companies, and on federal and state social services. This is not only an unnecessary but also critically unfair to a large group of people in our society. To prevent this scenario, changes must begin now. Mercyhurst is dedicated to educating and preparing all of our graduates for productive careers. We've tried to develop partnerships and have with the Verizon Foundation, the PNC Bank Foundation, Conquer the Canyon, and other private donors. The next step for the AIM program is to fund and launch our internship program for our seniors and provide job coaches as needed to prepare them for the workplace. The AIM program has been cited as a model program and has implemented a majority of the innovative components of the program with limited resources and opportunities beyond the commitment of the university. It is our hope that a strong consideration is made for allocations of government resources to fund programs like the Asperger Initiative at Mercyhurst that assist students not only in receiving a college education, but also in helping them become productive citizens in our society. As a provider and a father, I strongly feel we need to act now before the task before us becomes insurmountable. Thank you again for your time and this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. McGarry, for your testimony. Mr. Carley, you are now recognized for your testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I would ask for just a little bit of leeway, since having only been asked to speak Monday morning, I haven't had the same amount of editing time as many of my colleagues. Just a minute or two would be most graceful.
Well, do your best and we'll work with you.
Thank you very much. As the Executive Director of both ASTEP and GRASP, and on behalf of both my boards, I would like to thank all the members of the committee here for having me to speak. I bring two concerns, both of which shed light on a population of people on all sides of the spectrum and on all sides of the many controversies that exist in the autism-Asperger world, who are simply overwhelmed. And I hope to be able to stress the negative consequences on us all when so many are enduring financial, logistical, and emotional stresses of a magnitude that might surprise you. My first concern is the more standard apprehension concerning the direction and prioritization of government funding. Currently, the emphasis is on government research, and there is good herein, as well as fairness, for there is a vastly disproportionate amount of research funding for autism when compared with infinitely less prevalent conditions. All that said, however, research is based on the future and not where our greatest need lies, which is in the present. Today, the services we collectively offer is paltry in comparison with the true need that's out there right now. The majority of our families still do not have the appropriate services, interventions, or educations available to their children, and adults on the spectrum are starved for appropriate housing, therapies, and employment opportunities. And if fiscal concerns are indeed something which we measure things by, then let's think of that adult who, if they are able, in a job employment program, to become a tax-paying, productive member of society rather than existing on government support, seems to me like a financial no-brainer. And for those who are not able to participate in programs like that, think of the productivity that is lost because the parents can't produce like they used to. Why we never consider the fiscal cost of not providing services is still a mystery to me. And I disagree with some of the testimony we have had here before. We are not amidst a health crisis. We are amidst a services crisis. My second concern has to do with how we implement whatever direction we take in terms of the tone or the language being used. Now, tone or language may seem like PC, self-help, feel-good spin to a lot of people, and I understand that. But it's not for someone on the spectrum who grows up having to hear words like cure, disease, defeat, and combat, words that have no medical basis given the genetic component of autism. For though we may improve dramatically, we're born with this, and we will die with this. And such negative self-imagery makes self-esteem so much harder to achieve for an individual who is at a psychological disadvantage, enough as it is. We have to remember that the majority of this population now can read what's being written about them and hear what's being said about them. And as we all grow, whether we're on the spectrum or not, we need to hear about what we can do, not what we can't do. Autism is simply more complicated than any of us want it to be. Try as we may, we cannot sloganize it, we can't dumb it down. And historically, our refusal to accept the complexities of this vast spectrum has created a competition of suffering amongst ourselves that has made the autism world and its politics one of the most emotionally unhealthy atmospheres you could ask to work in. Is this because we're all so overwhelmed, thanks to unmet service needs, to process these different lives in a more productive manner? I think the answer is yes. Now, I was lucky. When my then 4-year-old son and I were diagnosed with Asperger's in late 2000, I was at a point in my life where I had a family, I had a career. It was a weird life. I was a starving playwright by night and a minor league diplomat during the day, working in such places as Bosnia and Iraq. But there was proof that there was possibility within my son's diagnosis. Most other parents might have resorted to praying that their child could have a future. Thanks to my diagnosis and the life lived up to that day, I had the advantage of evidence-based conviction, not hope. And self-esteem was the most formulative factor in all of that. Now, granted, I am at one end of the spectrum, and I understand that to many parents I will seem like the possible and not the probable. But I also would never invalidate that the prognosis for me was once not so good, nor that my behaviors haven't dramatically changed for the better. And what is considered probable has changed immensely over the last 10 years, and that is a credit to everybody working in the autism world. Self-esteem, again, was the most predominant quality that got me to that point, because unlike other people on the spectrum who are brilliant, I don't have that kind of a brain. And lastly, it's an ethical mistake whenever we sacrifice the possible in the name of the probable. As national nonprofits, like government thus far.
One question. Is there one more point you wanted to make, or is this your conclusion?
This is the concluding paragraph.
Okay, fine. Well, take your time. I didn't mean to rush you that much, but I thought you had another whole point you were developing.
I'm good, sir. No.
Okay, thank you.
As national nonprofits, like government thus far, we too have often failed to lead. Our centrists have frequently been too hesitant, but more damaging are the militants on opposite ends of the controversies who have pandered to their members' anger, anxiety, or depression with alarmist rhetoric, misinformation, fight talk, and all this encouraging the search for a bad guy, somebody to blame, thereby pouring gasoline on the fires of the people that are looking to us for leadership, instead of helping them with messages of acceptance, respect, openness to a path that may be different from what was expected, and helping them get the services they need. I ask this administration, as well as our community, to lead and to help these constituents in such a way that will not just be acceptable to the polls or pander to any ill-conceived notion that an injustice was done or that there's something in the water. I cannot stress enough my disappointment that the conversation on vaccines is still evident. Despite the immense progress.
Mr. Carley, at this point, I appreciate that, but in respect to each of the panelists, I've given you a significant period to go on, but please appreciate that we will take your testimony in its written form and assure that it is part of the written record. Thank you so much. Mr. Neiman, at this point in time, I recognize you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and esteemed members of the committee. My name is Ari Naaman. I represent the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, an organization run by and for autistic people. I also previously served on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, and let me just say, as an autistic person and as a taxpayer, I want to thank you for giving self-advocates a seat at the table today. I'd like to begin with a story. Earlier this year, I was visiting a service provider in New York, and I happened to meet a young man my age. We'll call him Joe. And Joe is autistic, like me, but unlike me, Joe doesn't speak. He had come in with his father to try and find a job, and I had the chance to sit down with him and his dad and ask some questions. And Joe, despite not speaking, found ways to be very actively involved in that conversation. He pointed at what he was interested in, shook his head at what he wasn't. He had plenty to say, and few people had ever bothered to pay attention. No one had ever given Joe the simple support of a communication device. That technology exists. It has for years. We just don't invest in it. And I think about Joe a lot at times like this because the current autism research agenda largely ignores his needs. I'm a big believer in the old maxim, in God we trust, everyone else please bring data. So if you don't mind, I'd like to point to some of the data in the autism research agenda and see what it shows us. In 2010, NIH spent about $217 million on autism research. Of that, only 2.5% went to research on improving the quality of services. Only 1.5% went towards research on autistic adults and our needs. Now, when you compare that to the percentage of the research agenda focused on causation and biology, the attention paid to the needs of us here today is laughably small. Now, I'm not here to speak for all autistic people. That's impossible. But I am here to speak for the right of every autistic person to get the support they need to speak for themselves and not to be written off as victims or burdens. Now, some have tried to justify the lack of attention paid to services and adult issues through talk of an epidemic. I don't happen to subscribe to that theory, but if we wanted to study it and evaluate it scientifically, a very simple step we could take would be to research the prevalence of autism in the adult population. The United Kingdom, in fact, conducted that study and found a comparable rate of autism in adults as in children. We should be doing that here, and regardless of the result, we would gain valuable information on supports for autistic adults. I want to highlight 3 additional points noted at more length in my written testimony. First, I think it's very important to stress that there are really severe racial, income, and gender disparities in the autism world. As was mentioned earlier, African American children are diagnosed significantly later than Caucasian children. Department of Education data has also showed us that low-income and minority youth on the spectrum have the lowest rates of employment and higher education access in the years after they leave school. We also know that gender plays a big role. Many believe that the 4-to-1 ratio of boys to girls being diagnosed is at least partially a self-fulfilling prophecy, with girls less likely to be identified because they don't fit the stereotype. Second, I think it's important we recognize that when we talk about autism services, we're mostly talking about services with the word disability, not autism on them. So we have to talk about programs like IDEA and Medicaid, and a few words on Medicaid in particular. The vast majority of disability services are financed through Medicaid. If that program were block granted or otherwise significantly cut, those services would be devastated. I cannot emphasize this enough. Ending a robust Federal commitment to Medicaid means ending any meaningful chance we have to support autistic people. Third and finally, I want to stress the importance of building a pathway to employment for my community. Our current disability service provision system actually makes it very hard for people who want to work to enter the workforce. If you're leaving school, you have to choose between going without support or committing to exit the workforce in order to qualify for SSI and Medicaid. Quite frankly, that's just bad public policy. If you want autistic people to be tax-paying citizens, and we want to be, we need a service system that emphasizes employment. The Affordable Care Act has made some progress towards those ends. Another good example of what more we could do can be found in the TEAM legislation, a bipartisan collection of bills on transition for youth with disabilities introduced by Representatives Harper and McMorris-Rogers. In closing, I want to point out that historically, most disability movements have a certain life cycle, and autism is no exception. In the beginning, most public attention focuses on questions of cure and causation. But with time, both advocates and policymakers realize that the real issues relate to helping support and defend the civil rights of people today. Now, in autism, that process is still going on, but I'm confident. I'm confident because I believe this is a civil rights issue, and I believe that the United States of America can guarantee the civil rights of all of its citizens. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Neiman, and thank you to each of the panelists. Now, in regular order, the Chair will recognize Mr. Burton from Indiana. Mr. Burton.
First of all, I want to thank you all very much for being so patient. I mean, we grilled those people for, what, about 3 hours, and you had to sit there. So I want to tell you, I'm amazed that your posteriors could survive that long. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to say is that Abraham Lincoln said, "Let the people know the facts and the country will be saved." And one of the problems that we have is that I don't think there's enough information getting out to the people who are not affected. I was like that. I didn't know much about autism until my grandson became autistic. And then all of a sudden it became a cause célèbre for me, and it was fortunate that I was chairman at the time, so I had the resources at my disposal to do something about it. So I'm asked my staff, I want you to get a copy of this whole hearing, every one of you. You can get it on the Internet. What's our Internet website? Governmentoversight.house.gov. Governmentoversight.house.gov. And I would urge all of you to disseminate this whole hearing and try to get as many people as possible to look at that. Because the more people that know what's going on and understands it, the more likely we are to get some kind of positive result out of the FDA and HHS. And they get a lot of money over there. I don't know why in the world they can't allocate more money for this whole issue. And that's why it's important that you keep beating the drum. I'm retiring. This is my last year in office here. Been here 30 years, but my last year. But I want you to know, any of you that have need any of your organizations, you get a hold of me, and I'll do everything I can to help you, because this is something I feel very strongly about. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is we have what's called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund. It has $2.4 billion in it, and it's not being disseminated to people who have damaged children. And it's because we have a system which was supposed to be user-friendly that is not user-friendly. We have special masters that are saying, you know, we can't prove or can't make sure that this person deserves any money out of that fund. And so I think it's important that we beat the drum on that, because there's $2.4 thousand million in there. And there's a lot of money for people who really could use it. And that was put in there by the pharmaceutical companies to help people in a user-friendly way to solve these problems. I think that's about all I have to say, except I'm very sympathetic to all of you. We've had, I don't know how many hearings on this subject over the past decade, but the problems just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And we really need you not only to be the foot soldiers, but the people that are going to lead the charge to make this a cause célèbre for everybody, even those who aren't affected by autism. It will affect everybody that knows anything about autism, because these people are going to live, as we said before. You've all mentioned this to a degree. These people are going to live for some time, and they're going to be a burden not only on the families but on society. We had people come before my committee whose children they were afraid of. They would lock the doors when the kids got out of control because they were so big. People that mortgaged their homes and lost everything they had taking care of their kids. That is not widely known. And that's why it's important that you guys keep beating the drum and get the message out there, not just for your family, but for everybody in our society. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Burton, and thank you for your passionate advocacy on this issue for your tenure. And we genuinely appreciate your leadership and look forward to hoping that we can continue to carry the mantle. At this moment, let me recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
I think, you know, I want to thank all of you for shedding so much light on the subject. I think my frustration comes with regard to trying to make sure that we take your pain, as I was telling you, Mr. Wright, that has now been turned into a passion, to make sure you carry out your purpose to help the folks that you want to help. And I'm sitting here trying to figure out, how do we effectively and efficiently use your energy and your passion so we get something done. You know, I was listening to you, Mr. Blaxell, and basically, if I understood you correctly, it seems as if you feel that there has been a lot of game playing. And I don't know if you used the word fraud, but you came pretty close. And, you know, as I listen to you all and I think about how these numbers are increasing, we are marching into a very, very serious situation. And I know, Mr. Neiman, you said don't call it an epidemic or whatever you said, but this is serious stuff. You've got, and you all know, but I'm just listening to you. I'm sure you got parents who have to give a lot, and so their productivity is affected. We've got people who are struggling with this and not getting the services that I guess could make them even more productive. Am I right? Is that what you're saying, Mr. Carley?
It is, and I do want to reinforce this is, in fact, very serious. My concern with the rhetoric of epidemic is that it, A, seems to stand in contravention to a growing amount of science exploring whether or not we are seeing a rise in incidence or a rise in diagnosis. But B, I'm concerned about the population that Congresswoman Norton mentioned earlier, many of whom are my members and Mr. Carley's members, who have often gone for decades without diagnosis or who have been misdiagnosed. The perception that autism is some recent new thing has been very damaging, in part because it's meant when we talk about autistic adults at all, which we do very rarely, we never talk about their needs. We always talk about it as something very recently on the horizon or about to be on the horizon. And we have to recognize this is a very serious situation. It's a very serious situation now, and it's a crisis not of epidemic or public health, but of unmet need and of human rights.
And that goes to my very question, and maybe you can address this, somebody. Tell me the kind of services that are lacking that you would like to see provided, again, so that we can try to figure out how we can use our dollars effectively and efficiently to not only, I think it was you, Mr. Carley, who said, you know, yeah, we got to look at the future, we got to do our research. Somebody said this, but we've got to also make sure that we deal with the now, because the people in this room, I take it, are going to go home and they're going to have to wrestle with this with love and affection 24/7. So while they are, I guess they have two situations. One, they're reaching into the future and saying, you know what, we want to understand what's happening here. We want to know the causes. We want to see if there are cures or whatever. We want that. But we also need some help right now,
Exactly. And if I may,
and what help is that? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
It's a myriad of things. I mean, for parents of more challenged children, we're talking about ABA therapy in the home. We're talking about a variety of educational strategies. We're talking about an appropriate education and perhaps, you know, just some aftercare if the child is significantly, you know, challenged enough. For someone that isn't as challenged, we need much more enforcement of IDEA in the schools. The schools are still able to circumvent that. I know it's budgetary, but it's still a problem that needs to be fixed. Adults themselves, they need appropriate housing. Adults need therapeutic options. When you grow up living in the behavioral minority and you're living in a world that confuses you a lot, you need to talk to somebody about that. But most of all, especially for adults, those employment programs, putting them into being productive use. This is not a population of people that are short on brain cells. It's social deficits, it's executive functioning issues, it's hidden curriculum issues. They can be put to work. Now, if I may, though, just backtrack, because, again, we've heard so much about prevalence rates and the confusion of where did these numbers come. Not once have I heard today the fact that the DSM-IV, which is what diagnoses people and constructs what the criteria is for who deserves a diagnosis, not once has anybody said here today that one of the reasons for the expanding diagnosis was the expanding criteria to what meets a diagnosis. First off, the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome in 1994 certainly opened up the book to a plethora of people, including myself, who never otherwise beforehand would have qualified for an autism spectrum disorder. But even traditional autism, the definition was changed in that book. I may get these numbers wrong, but in the old book, I believe it was 6 mandatory criteria for a diagnosis of autism. So if you got 5 but not 6, back in those days, it was mental retardation. Now, I believe it's 8 optional out of a field of 16 possible criteria. That blows those numbers off the roof.
Thank you. I see my time is up.
Mr. Cummings, there does seem to be, would you want to be recognized for a minute if Mr. Blaxall has a quick comment to be made?
I'd like to
I would like to
elaborate on the service question, if possible.
Excuse me, Ari.
If you can, we're trying to extend a courtesy to allow this important question. Mr. Blaxall, if you will.
Thank you.
You did raise your hand.
I want to raise 2 points just to correct the record. First of all, the 1 in 88 numbers, one of the problems with what the CDC does is they don't break out the categories. So we don't even have the tools to inspect the claim that there's been diagnostic expansion, that the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome made a difference. To the extent that there is data in the CDC numbers, Asperger's syndrome is a very small proportion of the total categorized cases, less than 10%. So the notion that we've had diagnostic expansion, that dog don't hunt as an explanation. And DSM-IV, if you actually read what the designers of DSM-IV wrote about it, they said it was supposed to be a corrective narrowing of the diagnosis. That was their intention. So I think this notion that we've got diagnostic expansion is a dangerous one. Another point I want to make, and I didn't have a chance to make it, the great unmentionables, vaccines and mercury, as causation factors. If we have an environmental epidemic, which is what I think common sense will tell you we have to look at plausible candidates that could possibly explain the inflection point that we saw in 1990. And so far, the best candidates we have are mercury, and there's a lot of evidence that supports mercury as a causative factor and a damaging factor. And the vaccine issue is a tough one. There are, contrary to what CDC representative said, there have been no studies of the total health outcomes of an unvaccinated population as compared to a vaccinated population. The studies that have been done cover only one preservative and one product. We haven't looked at combinations. We haven't looked at the totality. And those studies are often done poorly. And what we hear about are the studies that CDC has done, which I would argue there's been statistical trickery. But if you actually look at the record, mercury, for example, there was one paper that was written, showed that 43 out of the 58 studies on mercury and autism, or heavy metals and autism, were positive. It's the other 15 that we hear about in the press. So the scientific record is very supportive of the environmental concerns that parents and families have. It's complicated. There's controversy, obviously, but the notion that the controversy is settled or that all the evidence weighs on one side, that's politics in science. That's not an issue of the evidence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blaxall. In regular order, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning, but Mr. Wright, this testimony today has been revealing, and in many ways what struck me has been the fact that we can have been at this issue for so long, and there's such a wide divergence just even in the scientific definition of where we are, the accurate identification. You've spent a great deal of your time, resources, and passion in this issue. Now, one of the things I was trying to explore, and I know you've been discussing, we've got this interagency autism coordinating committee that the government has, but it seems to be missing the mark if we can be so far off on this. So give me your impression of what we should be doing right.
What we need is a national strategic plan. There are many government agencies that are doing a lot of good things, but they're not necessarily together. The money is significant, but it isn't necessarily spent in as thoughtful a way as possible. There needs to be a combination of the CDC, the NIH, and the FDA as an example to actually undertake the correct research, stay with it, especially in safety research on vaccines going forward. And there needs to be some place, there should be an Assistant Secretary of Health, the ASH title has been around for a long time. Somebody has to coordinate all this activity and try to make That's where you bring in services. The NIH doesn't do services. So they'll just tell you that. We don't do services. CDC doesn't do services. And so you've got, but yet it's done inside of Health and Human Services, but it's not coordinated. So a national plan, a national strategic plan would be what I would advocate to try to pull that together. I think that's a very important thing. It also involves continuing medical education for pediatricians. It also involves going to medical schools. There's nothing. You know, mental conditions occupy a fraction time in medical school. Then people go into practice, and what we deal with is a lot of ignorance. So you have to keep, that has to be organized. So that would be my fondest hope.
Mr. Badish, did you have a comment with respect to that?
I would just suggest, with all respect, that the IAC doesn't coordinate.
I'm sorry?
That the IAC doesn't coordinate. And that until we recognize, as Mr. Wright says, that we have to look at this as a national societal issue. And you can't have a body that's tied into, as Mr. Wright said, into a health research mode, looking at this whole element of autism. The service needs are there, the civil rights issues. When you don't have the Department of Education sitting at the table, where every single parent and every
or Department of Labor might be another suggestion, or even the Department of Justice.
It has to be a coordinated body. And with respect to the administration, we've talked to them, and I think they understand that now. But it has to start, in our opinion, from moving IAC, which is, as Mr. Smith knows, is a great concept, but it's in the wrong place. And it has to have a societal commitment that we're going to address this need as a lifespan issue from birth till death. And until then, we're not going to get anything. IAC, I've been the president of the Autism Society for a year and a half. IAC, despite what they say, they've never approached us. So if they're doing a national plan, God love it, you would think they would approach the largest grassroots organizations. I assume they haven't approached most of us at this table. That's a major problem.
Mr. Black, so if I understood your testimony, you identified that there has been extensive research going on in something that you would suggest isn't even relevant to the discovery of what's going on. Was it genetics, or was I correct in that?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we've spent tens of millions, hundreds of millions on what I call the great autism gene hunt. You know, when common sense would tell you that if we've gone from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 88, something has changed.
Who, in addition, adopts your position, and why would that issue not have been raised prior to today?
I think it comes back to the strategic planning issue. When a group of us pushed for the Combating Autism Act of 2006, one of the critical provisions of that was the idea of a strategic plan to make IAC and to make the NIH funding mechanisms accountable to the public. I spent 25 years in management consulting. I was a senior partner at one of the top management consulting firms in the world. If there's anything I can claim to be an expert in, and I hate to invoke expertise because that's often a way to keep the people out, but I'm an expert in strategic planning. And I was asked to participate in one workshop at NIH, and I can tell you that the process that we were engaged in was an interesting one. It had nothing remotely.
Were you shut out with respect to your commentary, or was there?
It was just an occasion to gather a group of people for a meeting, and the leaders of the NIH did what they wanted to do in the first place anyway. It wasn't accountable in any meaningful way to they didn't. It was. You get into the details, but there was an attempt not to have a strategy. It was an attempt to defend the status quo.
My time is up, but one of the things, and Mr. Issa has clearly stated the intention of this committee to continue to look at this, and that would be you would arm us if you would help us with identifying the kind of questions that you would like to have asked if we had these same individuals from that coordinating committee sitting at this table that would help us articulate in your voices the kind of inquiry that would shake that and produce a result that would help us deal just on the front end. And I'm sympathetic to all your issues on the back end as well, but my time has run out. And so at this point in time,
I would suggest that those answers might be urgency, goals, milestones, time frames, and passion.
In that order. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to also commend all of you for your patience, for your passion, for your interest, and for your hopes. because notwithstanding the frustration that we all express, if you didn't think there was some possibility that something could happen, you wouldn't be here. And that's an indication that wherever there is life, I've been told, that there is hope. You know, I was reminded of a poet who suggested that some people see things that are and ask why, but I dream of things that have never been and ask why not. And it seems to me that you're saying, why can't we have the services that we need? Why can't we have the kind of diagnosis that are accurate and give us the best chance and the best possibility? Why can't we even find, although we know it's difficult, we know that resources are scarce, that money is short, but we also know that priorities determine how we use whatever resources that they are. And so you're asking, really, all of those questions. I am one who believes that this fellow Sam Cooke was probably pretty accurate when he wrote the words about change coming. When he said that I was born by the river in a little tent. And just like that river, I've been running ever since. It may be a long time coming, but I know some change is going to come. I can think of illnesses and the way we've handled them in the past, and maybe there wasn't much hope. I remember living in a county where there was one physician for the whole county. Well, it took some time, but there are more than one physician in that county now. And so, quite frankly, you give me a great deal of hope that there is possibility that when we add all of the factors together and when the American people will have spoken, we will see some movement and we will see some possibility. Mr. Neiman, let me ask you, you mentioned the whole business of different kinds of disparities, which is something that I've been dealing with all of my life. Could you speak a little bit more and elaborate on what those disparities are and how you see them?
Absolutely. So we know that African American and Hispanic children are diagnosed later in life. It was mentioned earlier in the hearing that we see lower rates of diagnosis in the Hispanic population. And I really thank you for asking that question, Congressman, because it gives us an opportunity to call attention to the fact that we aren't doing a very good job of cultural competency in diagnosis for English language learners, for racial and ethnic minorities, for low-income communities, for women and girls, and also particularly for adults. When we look at insurance coverage and efforts to address insurance coverage needs for individuals on the autism spectrum, often the emphasis is very specifically on children, and adults are not included in state laws or Federal research efforts that emphasize these needs. All of the incidence statistics you heard earlier focused on 8-year-olds. We don't look at the population beyond that. I also think we can't underestimate the role of poverty in this. And to be a disabled person is to choose essentially between accessing no supports or going on the SSI program, which places extremely draconian limits on the income you can earn and what you can save. People on SSI can't save more than $2,000 in assets. Until we address the systemic poverty that forces people with disabilities, including autistic people and our families, to be held behind economically, we're not going to be able to address the racial, income, and gender disparities in the autism world.
And all of those who have come, and please know that there are some individuals in public office who share much of the hope and much of the concern and much of the anxiety that you have expressed. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And the Chair recognizes the skillful capacity with which you were able to get the great Sam Cooke into the record. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our panelists for their wonderful insights and incisive testimony. You know, one of the issues that Mr. Badich raises and admonishes the committee to look at the increased Federal response to the needs of adults living with autism, and I think that's echoed by other panelists and by all of us. We have not done even a scintilla of what we need to be doing to address that important issue. I would like to focus on older parents, the need for support. I think they have few parallels. I've known many autistic families, and there is a burden that they carry that is so grossly underappreciated, and so many of them do it with such grace and with such dignity. Great courage, and I think we need to recognize that. But what I'm finding, and I know we all find this, that many of those parents who have older children who are autistic, and they're no longer children, they are adults, are facing a fright that they may soon pass on, what happens to their child, and even physically, the inability to deal with particularly a young man who's got strength, and they increasingly do not. I hosted Chuck Colson's daughter, who wrote a wonderful book called Dancing with Max, who goes through her whole life and what it's been like, and that's one of the concerns she expressed with us. So perhaps Mr. Wright or Mr. Badich, if you could speak to it, others as well, this idea of older parents and aging out. And secondly, Mr. Wright, if you could, speak to you laid out 5 very specific points, pillars for a national strategy. We're in the second decade, obviously, and pardon me, you know, maybe you don't like the language, but my wife has a severe immunity disease called myasthenia gravis, and a very severe case of it. When we talk about defeating and combating and curing, we mean it. And she deals with it, and she'll say it herself. And I do certainly understand where you're coming from, but we do need, I think, combating is a way of rousing people to say more resources to fight it. But, Mr. Wright, if you could speak to the 5 points and then talk about the older parents and the older children, young adults.
Right on the table right now, there are 2 service issues that are in front of Congress. And one of them is the ABLE Act, which is not confined to autistic children, but for disabled, and it's just the savings. And that has 240 co-sponsors in the House and can't get to the floor, but you only need 218 votes. So I would urge you to try to get that to the floor and get that passed with 240 co-sponsors. That is something that can help families, especially working on aging children when the parents are able to put some money into that account. And the second one is there is sitting out here now that there is autism insurance for home or office or wherever in 32 states, covering 75% of the population of the country. That has to be brought back here to Congress so the ERISA companies, who are exempt from that, which are the largest companies in the country and occupy roughly half the working population. We now have half the working population in the smaller companies protected, but not the larger ones. That has to be done by Congress. That has to get on the table. In past years, that was not a difficult proposition. It's an equity issue. You have a small grocery store that is local, and they have coverage, and the chain store right next door doesn't provide the coverage. So there's 2 issues here that relate, again, to families and to give them service opportunities and hopefully reduce their debt burden, and especially the ABLE, which is a planning issue, especially as people age out. Housing is an enormous issue. We're going about it on a state-by-state basis. I don't know how to bring that to the Federal government at this point in time, but it's going to have to get coordinated It's very difficult.
Yeah, thank you. I would mention one of the things with aging parents, and particularly we now have a large group of individuals, 80s, 90s, who are the primary caretaker for an adult child, 60 or 70. The portability of Medicaid is a major issue, because sometimes when that person needs a caretaker, if that's the condition, the caretaker lives in another state, the individual moves to the state and has to get put on a waiting list. It could be 5, 6 years, which just makes absolutely no sense to us. The other issue is I think we have to do a better job of working with those parents and providing more options. The lack of housing for adults, and particularly in community settings, is dismal. And until we start recognizing, and again, I think Mr. Neiman said this is a civil rights issue. When housing authorities when they define their services to disabilities as having handicap ramps, they're falling a little short. So when we put more services and make those that are responsible for certain things in the communities, make those services available for people with autism, it's going to make it easier for an adult with a child.
I want to make a point about aging out and services. I think if we think about when the inflection point in the increased rate of autism was, around 1990 or thereabouts, that's about 22 years ago. And so what we're looking at, if you just say that the leading edge of the epidemic is 22 years old, those kids are just now leaving the special education system. They're well cared for in their families by and large. They're cared for in the special education system. But as they age out, we're facing a tsunami of unmet needs for services, desperate families, aging parents, and the nightmare of every parent, if late at night at the bar when you're talking about these things at get-togethers, is what happens when I die. What's going to happen to my child when I die? Because the vast majority of these children can't advocate for themselves, or when they become adults, they're going to be disabled, they're going to be dependent, they can be abused, they can be taken advantage of and not cared for, and with often tragic outcomes. And we haven't begun to see the wave of difficulties that we're going to face. If we're going to have rational policy, we need to face up to that, and it's going to be a massive problem.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Did you have? Well, the chair will indulge you with that.
Just very briefly, you mentioned the BRIC study in your, and I invited CDC and the ATSDR to BRIC Township. ATSDR ruled out that there was an environmental pathway. You mentioned that there's a blackballing. Could you elaborate on that? If not now, certainly for the record of environmental researchers by NIH.
I could certainly provide for the record. We have all sorts of private conversations with scientists. Safe Minds funds science. We wish we had the resources of Autism Speaks. We wish Autism Speaks, and I know Bob is an advocate of environmental research, but we'd love to see more from Autism Speaks. We'd love to see more from NIH. We do work a modest amount, and so we're in contact with scientists. And the private conversations you have with scientists is that there are third rails. There are politically incorrect issues. There are career consequences for doing a certain kind of study, and there have been ritual punishments of certain scientists out there. Some very public, some more private, and there are innumerable. There are many examples of those. And when the scientists say, "Oh, we should let the scientists take care of that," no. It's not a self-regulating process, because, in fact, the leaders of NIH enforce the orthodoxy of the scientific establishment, and if you take on third-rail questions, those are suppressed. We have many examples of those. I could provide some more.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank the chair. Mr. Davis made a good point when he talked about the Sam Cooke song about change is going to come. Although in most of our lives, there's an old adage that change usually occurs at a time of tragedy or crisis, and I think we were far past both those right now. So I want to redirect, though, a little bit. I got to tell you, Mr. McGarry is here from Mercyhurst. Mercyhurst recognized this a long time ago. I'm going to say mid-'80s, right? But then all of a sudden in 2009, you come out with the AIM program, which is the Asperger's Initiative at Mercyhurst. Would you share a little bit with us what you have been able to do? And I know you've spoken throughout Pennsylvania. You've also presented internationally what Mercyhurst is doing and some of the innovation that you've brought in. And again, if you would, just tell us how you share some of that information, how you're able to disseminate to other people, because I think there is, once we become aware, we can usually fix things. The more awareness, the better it is, and we had a chance to visit a little bit today. I admire what you have done, just not only in your academic life, but in your personal life. I know you're a person of passion. If you could share a little bit with the people here today with what Mercyhurst is doing in the AIM program.
Two parts of the question. What are we doing to disseminate information? Mercyhurst participated in May. In Pennsylvania, we had the opportunity to have the first inaugural conference on autism in the higher education setting. And Mercyhurst and 5 or 6 other institutions presented there on some of what we're trying to do, and 32 different colleges and universities were represented in the audience of that conference to learn what they could do to start implementing some of the programming and things that we're offering. What we're offering at Mercyhurst is not rocket science. It's not a brand new treatment option. Some folks have talked about applied behavioral analysis, and we have collaborated with our program at Mercyhurst and ABA. But we're doing a lot of tracking and looking at the students and saying, we've identified 4 main domains that we feel are very essential for our students in the academic setting as well as vocational. And they are academic social progress, independence, social, and emotional. So we try to track those 4 things specifically, because what we're finding is if our students are lacking or having difficulty on 2 of those domains, the probability that they're going to be successful in the higher education setting and or a vocational setting drastically decreases. So we're going to continue to kind of work on that. Another thing that we are doing is a peer mentoring program. And what we found is many of the students in our program have been in mentoring partnerships, but they've never been the mentor. So we've just recently implemented our peer mentoring program, where our students do meet with peer mentors at the university, but they also are going to be going down to social service agencies within Erie that have other folks that have severe disabilities and are going in as a mentor to them to say, I have accomplished something. I am a college student. People said I would never be here, and I am. And I want to help you and mentor you in what obstacles you need to face and get you through those obstacles as well. So that's some of the things we're doing.
Yeah, and as you and I talked today, we talked about employment opportunities and the idea that these are folks that can live a very productive life. They can be a big part of what it is we do as a country. And I think it's the awareness, and I really appreciate your coming here today and what you've done with your life. The more we become aware of it, the more we understand how to handle it, the more we can adapt and bring these people in with us and understand there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, we talked to Bill Gates. But, you want to talk about somebody who could be successful that has an autism disorder, but if you can, the 24% are actually employed, right? There's a lot of adults that can't get work. Just a little bit of that impact and what we could do to change that, because I think there is a great opportunity that these people have a meaningful life, something that they feel good about, that they get up in the morning and they can't wait to contribute.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think our vocational and our internship, unfortunately, we have a stigma, and we're working with students that have autism and are Asperger. Some of the vocational opportunities that are presented to Mercyhurst are far beyond the skills and the caliber of what our students can achieve. And so we need to have a strong awareness that, as some other panelists have said, autism is not necessarily an intellectual issue. If we can train and work on some of the social skills and the executive functioning, they can far succeed expectations and do some jobs much better than the rest of us can. Yeah. And we just need to train society to understand that and give these students those specific skills to accomplish that.
Amen. If I could, Mr. Chairman, would you share the conversation we had when we talked about the one student and the professor was outlining or giving them an assignment? I thought that was absolutely phenomenal, because what we see, sometimes we don't get it. You can't tell books by its cover. Share that, because I thought that was really uplifting.
Good. I had in the AIM program, we send a letter to every single faculty member stating that this student in your class is being supported by the Asperger Initiative, and if you or that student need resources, we are available. The faculty member contacted me on the second or third day of class and said, Brad, this student, I explained an assignment that was worth 60% of the grade of my course. And the student looked at me, and I really am not sure if he understood a word of what I was saying. And so can you work with him and help me work with him? That assignment was supposed to take 10 weeks. That student, the following Tuesday, turned that assignment in, and that professor said it was the most incredible piece of student graphic art that he had seen in 25 years. So we know that there's a misrepresentation from what we think is being heard and what is being processed in the caliber of students that we're working with.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for dedicating your life to making sure these people do have a life. Thanks so much. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. As promised, this was a long and well worthwhile hearing. We learned a great many things that both we and the public were not aware of. We didn't have an opportunity to hear from witnesses who had genetic links that they could see in their own families. We certainly did not hear from the witnesses who are women who recognize in their own lives that the under-evaluation because of perhaps differences in behavior between men and women lead there to be a discrepancy in recognition and a discrepancy in perceived challenge to women versus men. We certainly learned that the State of Utah has found a way to identify differently or better or more than other states. We certainly learned that, in fact, a passive discovery system is not going to get us or any other country in the world to an accurate number or to seek out people we could help and help early. This and more will be things that this committee will continue working on as part of the legacy of my predecessor, Mr. Dan Burton, for many years. There is nothing we heard today that is off limits for us to continue to explore. This committee stands ready to take your additional comments and questions as promised. There's a C-SPAN audience. We may perhaps get additional letters. We will try to include those in the record whenever possible. Lastly, I don't believe we covered every interest group either with our witnesses or here today. So because there are so many organizations involved that want to be heard, I would only ask all of you, when you work with other organizations or groups of individuals, that you explain to them that this committee will have a permanent staffing, at least as long as I'm chair, to try to continue to consolidate information and to get government to do its job more effectively, more efficiently, and if at all possible, find additional funds to continue dealing with all aspects of this disease. And with that, this committee stands adjourned.